Facing persecution. We are to trust God to empower us to avoid any form of idolatry, regardless of the persecution we may experience. Here's Gene.
This particular principle actually relates to Daniel's three friends. They faced a very unusual challenge in relationship to temptation as far as idolatry is concerned. Keep in mind that when this happened, now these three men, along with Daniel, are about 19 or 20 years old. And they face this tremendous challenge because we read in Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now we see that even though Nebuchadnezzar earlier had honored Daniel and his three friends because of the fact that Daniel was able to interpret that dream, he reverts to his arrogance. He was an incredibly arrogant individual. And here's this huge gold statue he builds. And what did he say? Well, if you look at verses 4 to 6, you'll find out exactly the decree that he had ordered. A herald loudly proclaimed, people of every nation and language. Now keep in mind, there weren't only Jews in Babylon. There were people from other nations. This was the Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar had taken control of many places, and they were all under the control of the king of Babylon. So, in essence, this herald states this, people of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music, you're to fall down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. In essence, he set this up to honor himself. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Now you talk about an incredible egomaniac. At this point in time, psychotic almost in relationship to his behavior. And so what happens? Well, as you read, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. Now remember, he knew who these three guys were because he'd already given them responsibility in the kingdom. And so he calls them in. And notice he said, why are you doing this? Who's going to rescue you if you don't bow down? Because you're going to go into that furnace of fire. And notice their response. It's incredible. 19 years old, 20 years old, facing this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. That was a bold response. But then they went on to say, but even if he does not rescue us, and it's interesting that they don't say if he exists, because inherent in their answer is we believe he exists. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. That's a line we cannot cross. Well, again, the king was furious. He had them heat the furnace up 7 times hotter. It was so hot that the men who actually cast them in the furnace were killed themselves and burned up by the flames. If you can imagine. This is not hyperbole. This is reality. But then something miraculously happened. The king looked into that furnace. And notice his response in verses 24, 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, of course, Your Majesty," they replied to the king. He exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Well, you and I know something that Nebuchadnezzar didn't know, and that was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ, standing there with these 3 young men in the midst of this blazing fire. And God preserved their lives. Now that leads us to an observation, and that is that, again, God is sovereign because in this case, God delivered them. But you consider Isaiah the prophet. We're told that Manasseh, an evil king in Judah, literally sawed him in 2. He died a horrible death. And he was one of the greatest servants of God. Why didn't God preserve him? We can only trust God. Micah died and his life was taken because of his stand as an Old Testament prophet. Habakkuk, he was stoned in Jerusalem as far as we know. He died. These were men of God, and yet their lives were not preserved. What about Stephen in the New Testament? A wonderful man of God, stood before the Sanhedrin, and testified to who Jesus Christ, the Messiah, was, and he was stoned. We read about this in Acts 7. They were stoning Stephen as he called out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not charge them with this sin." And saying this, he fell asleep, which is a euphemism for he died. Why didn't God preserve his life? Well, we can only say God is sovereign. "Though he slay me," Job said, "yet I'll trust him." And so consequently, we need to understand that we need to seek God's will. We need to be bold for him. But ultimately, God is in control of our lives. Paul's a wonderful example of that. His attitude, Philippians 1:20, where he wrote from prison. This was his own hired house, his first imprisonment, when he wrote to the Philippians, and he said, "My eager expectation and hope is that I'll not be ashamed about anything, but that now as always, with all boldness, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death." In other words, Paul said, I don't know whether I'm going to be delivered or not. If I'm not delivered, I'll go into the presence of the Lord, which is even better. But if I remain, it's best for you because I can continue to minister to you. Now, God in his sovereignty released Paul, but then he was taken back into prison. The second time, he was placed in a dungeon, and he was beheaded by the wicked King Nero. At least that's what tradition tells us, and we believe that actually happened. So again, God is sovereign. There are situations I don't understand. For example, the 5 missionaries that went into Ecuador to try to get contact with that Indian tribe. They were headhunters. And basically, all 5 of these men were speared to death as they landed their plane on a sand strip by a river. Why? All I can say, as a result of their death, there were more missionaries that went into the field to serve Christ than any other event in known time at that time. It was amazing what God did through Jim Elliot and those other 4 men who lost their lives. I think of John and Betty Stam, who went to China. They were there during the communist regime. Both of them, their lives were taken by Red Chinese men, murdered for the cause of Christ. Their little baby, by the way, was saved because she was hid in a sleeping bag, and these men missed her, and she's alive today, living in the Chicago area. But the fact is, why? We can only say, though he slay me, yet I'll trust him. So here we have an amazing principle, and the question simply is this: what are some of the ways Christians today compromise their walk with Christ when they are persecuted because of their faith? When we look at these three men, and their attitude was, the God we serve can save us if he wants. But if he doesn't save us, we will not bow down and worship this gold statue. God chose to answer prayer and to save them. In other instances, we know that God simply takes them home. But in terms of the very practical question that we face today, isn't it amazing that I know some Christians that when they go into a restaurant, they don't want to bow their heads and pray because they don't want anybody to see that they're Christians. They're afraid of rejection. Isn't that easy to do? To be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ? This principle, I think, speaks to all of us out of the lives of these men. And here's the principle. We're to trust God to empower us to avoid any form of idolatry, regardless of the persecution we may experience.